All right. Hello, everybody. Before I begin, I just wanted to thank the new people that have subscribed to me. I've seen that I'm getting new subscribers lately, and just wanted to say thank you to those people. Appreciate it very much, whether if you like the content or you don't like the content. Either way, it's all good to me. So thank you for the support. Anyhow, so I saw this article a few days ago, and it's, as you can see, it says, surprised by census results, many in Puerto Rico reconsider views on race. Puerto Ricans themselves are understanding their whiteness comes with an asterisk, and experts said. They know they're not white by U.S. standards, but they're not black by Puerto Rico standards. And I thought that this article was really, really interesting. Because there's one part in it that I found that stood out to me the most, and I'm going to kind of get into the reasoning as to why it stood out to me, or just my belief or whatever. So anyhow, I'm going to do what I do like I always do, read, and then I'll add my spiel to it at the end. Okay. All right. So by the Associated Press, San Juan, Puerto Rico. The number of people in Puerto Rico who identified as white in the most recent census plummeted almost 80%, sparking a conversation about identity on an island breaking away from a past where race was not tracked and seldom debated in public. Okay. So this is kind of what I'm going to get into a lot in this video. All right. The drastic drop surprised many, and theories abound as the U.S. territory's 3.3 million people began to reckon with racial identity. Puerto Ricans themselves are understanding their whiteness comes with an asterisk, said Yarimara Bonilla, a political anthropologist and director of the Center for Puerto Rican Studies at Hunter College in New York. Whoop, whoop, that's where I graduated from. They know they're not white by U.S. standards, but they're not black by Puerto Rico standards. Nearly 50% of those represented in the 2020 census, 1.6 million of 3.29 million, identified with two or more races, a jump from 3% or some 122,200 of 3.27 million who chose that option in the 2010 census. Most of them selected white and some other race. Meanwhile, more than 838,000 people identified as some other race alone, a nearly 190% jump compared with some 289,900 people a decade ago. Although Bonilla said Census Bureau officials have yet to release what races they chose, experts believe people likely wrote Puerto Rican, Hispanic, or Latino, even though federal policy defines those categories as ethnicity, not race. And what do I tell you? What do I say all the time? That I would prefer for these things to be a race. And we even got people on the island who probably would agree with that. All right. Among those who changed their response to race was 45-year-old Tamara Texador, who selected other in 2010 and this time opted to identify herself as Afro-descendant. She says she made the decision after talking to her brother, who was a census worker, and told her how people he encountered when he went house to house often had trouble with the question about race. Texador began reflecting about her ancestry and wanted to honor it since she descended from slaves on her father's side. I'm not going to select other, she recalled thinking when filling out the census. I feel I am something. Now this is, it reminds me a lot of the stuff that I talk about with identity all the time. And one of the things that I always say is when it comes to like race, racism, colorism, and all of that stuff, within Latin America itself, like I don't like to get into that. I like to focus on what's going on over here, because I feel like the issues and things are very different over there. Identity and all of that stuff is very different over there. So that's why I don't like to pry into that too much, because I don't live there. I've never lived there. So for the people that have lived there and they do know about it, that's understandable if they speak about it to me, But because I don't, I kind of just stay away from that to an extent. But, it is understandable. All right, so experts are still debating what sparked the significant changes in the 2020 census. Some believe several factors are at play, including tweaks in wording and a change in how the Census Bureau processes and codes responses. Bonilla also thinks a growing awareness of racial identity in Puerto Rico played a part, saying that extra intense racialization in the past decade might have contributed. She and other anthropologists argue that change stemmed from anger over what many consider a botched federal response to a U.S. territory struggling to recover from Hurricane Maria and a crippling economic crisis. They finally understood that they're treated like second-class citizens. Barbara Abadia Rexach, I don't know how that's pronounced, a sociocultural anthropologist, said of Puerto Ricans. Another critical change in the 2020 census was that only a little over 228,700 identified solely as Black or African American, a nearly 50% drop compared with more than 461,000 who did so a decade ago. I kind of wonder, I'm very curious as to why they would identify as African American over there. If they, you know what I mean? I'm very curious about that. Unless they're mixed with African, I mean, that would make sense. I don't know. Not sure. Well, maybe because they're technically American, maybe that they would kind of feel like maybe I should identify as that. I don't know. Very interesting. The decline occurred even as grassroots organizations in Puerto Rico launched campaigns to urge people to embrace their African heritage and raise awareness about racial disparities, although they said they were encouraged by the increase in the two or more races category. Bonilla noted Puerto Rico currently has no reliable data to determine whether such disparities have occurred during the pandemic, noting that there is no racial data on coronavirus testing, hospitalizations, or fatalities. The island's government also does not collect racial data on populations, including those who are homeless or incarcerated, Abadia Rexach added. All right. So this is something that I'm going to kind of get into with this. The fact that there's no racial data over there like that, right? And when I read this, what it reminded me of is what you always kind of hear, like the rhetoric that's always spewed, where it's like, oh, Latin people want to identify as white, you know, that we just want to be closest to whiteness and stuff like that, and you know, we don't want to embrace this culture, that culture, you know, our African ancestry, our native ancestry, and whatnot. But if there is no collection on racial data, I can see that when the questions are starting to be posed onto Puerto Rican people, and I would think in the rest of Latin America, I could see why that would be confusing to them. Because for such a long time, if there was no racial data on these things, right, then they're going to be confused themselves to an extent, right? So I thought that was really interesting. The denial of the existence of racism renders invisible, criminalizes, and dehumanizes many Black people in Puerto Rico, she said. The lack of such data could be rooted in Puerto Rico's history from 1960 to 2000. The island conducted its own census and never asked about race. So they never asked about race, right? So there could very well be a denial, right, with regards to racism over there. But then if you compound it with there was never, if the census never asked about race, then that's making the problem even more confusing, right? To me, it would. So we were supposed to all be mixed and all equal, and race was supposed to be an American thing, Bonilla said. And that's what you hear a lot. Right? You hear that a lot. People are always saying stuff like that, you know, in which, yes, we are mixed, right? But, you know, you do hear, especially from a lot of Latin people, that race is an American thing and that they don't see race. You see, that's a little extreme to me when they say that race is, you know, that they don't see race at all. But I can understand where they can be somewhat confused when it comes to their own identity with being mixed, and then out of nowhere, when there was for a long time there not being any type of racial tracking over there in the, you know, in places like Puerto Rico or maybe in other places in Latin America, and then out of nowhere there is, and then they know that, well, we know that we're mixed, and then they're not going to know how to answer these questions, right? So then to me it's two things, right? It's two things. So some argued at the time that Puerto Rico should be tracking racial data, while others viewed it as a divisive move that would impose or harden racial differences, a view largely embraced in France, which does not collect official data on race or ethnicity. Now, I could see that too, where it could be considered divisive to an extent, right? But then at the same time, I could also see why it's not necessarily divisive. So especially when they're talking about how within the criminal justice system over there, and how race is not tracked and whatnot, it kind of reminded me of the stuff that I did with regards to Latinos, and how race is not tracked over here in the States when it comes to people who are incarcerated, and how oftentimes Latin people are identified as white, and in some cases they're identified as black, right? And how because of that, funding when it comes to people who are incarcerated is lacking for Latin people because of that. And I did a video on that like a long time ago. So that's kind of what this reminds me of, right? So when I read this, that's what this reminds me of. So, yeah. For Isar Gadru, an anthropologist and professor at the University of Puerto Rico, that type of data is crucial. Skin color is an important marker that makes people vulnerable to more or less racial discrimination, she said. The data helps people fight for racial justice and determines the allocation of resources, Gadru said. The major shift in the 2020 census, especially how only 560,592 people identified as white versus more than 2.8 million in 2010, wow, comes amid a growing interest in racial identity in Puerto Rico, where even recent surveys about race prompted responses ranging from members of the human race to normal to I get along with everyone. That's cute. Informally, people on the island use a wide range of words to describe someone's skin color, including coffee with milk. That interest is fueled largely by a younger generation. They have signed up for classes of bomba and plena, centuries-old percussion-powered musical traditions, as well as workshops on how to make or wear head wraps. More hair salons are specializing in curly hair, eschewing the blow-dried results that long dominated professional settings in the island. Some legislators have submitted a bill that cites the results of the 2020 census, and that, if approved, will make it illegal to discriminate against someone based on their hairstyle. Several U.S. states already have similar laws, and that is very real. The hair stuff is very real. I've gone through it my whole life. My sister has gone through it a lot. My sister's gone through it a whole lot worse than I have. Her and I actually discussed that a long time ago. Let's say a couple years ago or so. And yeah, it's still a thing. And I've always had people tell me insults. I get compliments too. Well, I get insults, similar to my sister, but my sister has it, a lot worse than me, I would say. She's had the experiences with the, I guess you would say texturism a lot. Way more than I have, because her hair is just, it's different than mine. It's more coarse than mine. Her curls are tighter than mine. So she goes through a lot more. Okay. As debate continues on what sparked so many changes in the 2020 census, Bonilla said, an important question is what the 2030 census results will look like. We will see an intensification of this pattern, or 2020 would have been kind of a blip moment. So, yeah, that's pretty much it. So I found that to be really, really interesting, especially with regards to them not tracking race over there like that. Like, that's something, because that really changes things a lot, in my opinion. That really makes because you're always hearing about how we're just, we just want to praise the our Spanish roots or European DNA and all of that type of stuff, right? And it's not to say that stuff doesn't exist, but when you're when if for a long time over there, the race wasn't even considered like that, and it's always pushed over there, and maybe in different Latin American countries as that's an American thing, then it's gonna, to me, that would make the people more confused if they are already not that knowledgeable when it comes to race, right? And I think what I think is that it adds a little more. There's more to the story than just, oh, these people just want to identify as white. To me, that's what that said. There's more to the story than that. Than what the narratives that are constantly pushed, the bullshit narratives. So when I saw that, I was like, well, damn, how come nobody talks about that? How come, for the longest time, people might not have known that. All you hear is Latin people say, we don't go by race, we don't go by race. I get that. But if there was no clarity in it where it was like, okay, our census doesn't even discuss race or include race. If that specificity wasn't made, that's a big difference than just saying, we don't see race. I hope that makes sense. To me, it makes sense. All right. So that was it for me. Everybody already knows how I feel about these topics. So, but like I always say, I try to stay out of the stuff when it comes to Latin America, when it comes to Puerto Rico. But, because this was something that was, an NBC news article, whatever. I thought it would just be interesting to share, given the stuff that I talk about on my channel, and I talk about census stuff. So anyhow, that's about it. I guess I'm going to go for now, and I will see you all in my next video. Take it easy, guys. Bye.